Hello. Wendy, thank you so much for inviting me here. And thank you for your inspiring work that you're doing with Israelis and Palestinians, sharing your knowledge and strengthening the voices of those who want to live peaceful, just lives. My friends, it is a true privilege to be here, surrounded with so many people committed to social justice. I'm honored. First, I have to admit, it would have been more natural for me to stand here today with you as a teacher, not as a politician. Teaching was my original plan. My mom is a teacher, and I always thought that teaching is the best way to influence the world for the better. But 5 years ago, all of my plans suddenly changed. On the 14th of July 2011, Israeli society woke up to nothing short of a miracle: the spontaneous eruption of the biggest protest movement in Israel's history. Most of what you see on the news from Israel is about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is indeed our greatest, most important challenge. But Israel's political challenges are always interlinked with our social challenges. When Israel was established, our founders put a very progressive vision on the table. My grandparents, Iraqi, Romanian, Polish, Lithuanian, fled persecution in their home countries. And what they all hoped for was to build a real home, not just a shelter from anti-Semitism and from the horrifying atrocities they went through, but a home based on a fair economy, on true solidarity and democratic values. And that new state, merely a year after our war of independence that took the lives of 1% of the entire population, and with a broken economy, Israel passed as one of its first laws the Free Education Act. That was 1949, and our founders knew that public education is not just a basic right, it's a necessity for a country that wants security, economic growth, and sustainability. They knew that it was an investment, the same way that building great public healthcare services and a strong social security net were strategic decisions for a poor country in its very first few years. But things have changed. In the last few decades, with mostly right-wing governments that cut social funding and privatized basic services, Israel has moved dramatically from its original vision. We have gone from being a country cherishing fairness to #1 in the developed world in economic inequality. From a country that was founded by hard work, today we lead in the percentage of workers employed through outsourcing and subcontracting, with no security net. Israel is a small society. We're 80% Jews, 20% Arabs, and have always dealt with great waves of immigration. The economic pressure and social inequality made us ever more divided, but we kept quiet about it, as our main focus was the security threats we had suffered for generations. And so, from a country that knew how to confront challenges with brave pragmatism, we have become stuck with governments that used our fear to encourage inaction, and with a lack of political courage to reach the necessary two-state solution, putting Israel's future at great risk. 5 years ago, I was a student and worked full-time, but couldn't afford to rent a room in a shared apartment. My friends were in the same position. We had done everything right. We completed our mandatory army service and voluntary national service, studied hard, worked day and night, but we just couldn't make ends meet. Buying an apartment was a fantasy we had heard about from our parents. Slowly, as we talked with more people, we began to understand that these problems were not personal. Many people our age were in despair over their future. We decided that it was time to stop hiding in our collapsing house chairs and move into the streets. At first, it was just us, 10 people who started sleeping in the most central boulevard of Tel Aviv. But the next morning, somebody else pitched a tent in another town, and then a third tent was pitched. Within a week, there were 40 tent camps around the country. After a month, 120 tent camps. Eventually, there were 500,000 people marching on the street. Just to give you the American equivalent number, it would be translated into 20 million Americans marching together, shouting, "The people demand social justice." Just imagine what optimism, what hope. For us, it really felt like a miracle. And we soon realized that this was not a protest about housing prices. It was a protest about our home, about what happened to our home, and about what our beloved country must be. We demanded to get our country back. As the protest grew, we were confronted with unjust political violence. One night, I was taken under arrest just for practicing my legal right to protest. When I was sitting there, surrounded by activists, by teachers and social workers, students, people who, just like me, cared so much about the place we live in, who were willing to put great efforts into making it better, I realized that we had a problem. Because while we got the support of most Israelis, we had no political power. We were completely ignored by those who were making the decisions. And the truth is, we didn't even aim for that kind of power. In Israel, the young generation sees politics as the domain of politicians. They think politicians lie to them and rip them off. It is not hard to understand where this sentiment comes from, because politicians are often lie to us and rip us off. And I felt just the same way, but I couldn't allow it to continue. Because politics is not really about politicians. Politics is about possibility. It's about seeing the way things could be. It's about bringing people together to decide how to do that and making these possibilities real. It's about how to distribute the resources that we produce together. It's about how to make the best use of the tremendous power that we have when we stand together. It's about how to overcome danger and uncertainty that we can only surmount together. Instead of giving up on politics, young people need to take charge of politics. So I decided to run for office. I jumped into the Labour Party primary elections with no money and no political experience, but with hundreds of volunteers. Somehow, our combined power won me a place in the Israeli parliament. Now, the first thing you see when you enter parliament is that there's no guidebook. There's no politics for dummies guide or something that you can work with. But the first thing that I wanted to do, and the most important thing I wanted to do, was to sit in the finance committee. I wanted to discover what the government is doing with our money. And there, I discovered something that was completely secret, completely unknown outside of the political system. I discovered that the entire budget that our parliament votes on and approves is a fake. In Israel, we were constantly being told that there was no money for our collapsing social services, that public education is a privilege rather than a basic right. We didn't know that just after the budget was approved, right-wing politicians in the finance committee were moving around billions of shekels in public funding from the approved budget to special interest projects, often ones that benefited them politically. Now, I was 27 years old at the time, the youngest member of parliament, the youngest in the finance committee, and when I started fighting this corruption, more experienced politicians told me that you just don't understand how this system works. They tried to convince me to cooperate. When I kept investigating, they warned me that I should stop. That's how we've been doing this for decades. They told me, if you touch it, it will end your political career. But what I had discovered was too disturbing to ignore. The way it worked was that we were given this budget changes request minutes before we had to vote on it, leaving us no time to see the actual numbers. And again, we're talking about billions of shekels from our tax money. There was no way to study it alone in such short time, so I did what any sane person would do. I just uploaded everything to my Facebook page. And yeah, thank God for Facebook. Now, you know, we hear politicians tell us so many times that people are not really interested in the small numbers. Apparently, people are very interested. Within days, I had recruited dozens of volunteers, and together we built our transparency troops. We investigated every figure in the budget, forced the finance ministry to give answers on undocumented transfers, and created online platforms so the public could see what our government is really doing with our money. We discovered that the government was using this corrupt system for two reasons. The first reason was to transfer funds to their political cronies. The second one was to hide the real priorities from the public. Using that system, they could tell the public that they invest money in improving education, but in reality, transfer that money only to the sector they support politically, abandoning the weakest parts of our society. With that system, they could promise that they were trying to solve the housing problem, but in reality, they would build more for their political allies in the settlements. In fact, they could drag Israel into a one-state reality without asking the public what we really think about this plan. They used this system in order to avoid public discussion on some of our most crucial issues that we face. They did it secretly because they knew that the public disagrees. And after a year-long fight, we succeeded in making the Israeli national budget transparent for the first time in history. Some politicians are today under police investigation for corruption. Many within the political and the public sector understand now that things must change. Parliament established a special committee on transparency, one of the first in the world, and I serve as its chair. We're working hard to ensure that in the future, our money will be invested in schools, in hospitals, in public transportation and the welfare system. Also, after years of eroding unions, 150,000 new workers are now organized since the protest movement, including daycare workers, bus drivers, janitors, security guards, teachers, and social workers, even high-tech workers. Just this April, the leaders of a new teachers' organization came here to learn from you, from the AFT. They were strongly impressed by your professionalism and took home great ideas on how to promote social justice using strong community organizing. It is clear that when we come together, we can make significant change. For years, instead of solving Israel's problem, our government just pit us against each other. But we're not afraid. We're not afraid because we saw only a few decades ago the greatest example of how something that looks like a crazy dream can become reality. We saw how our grandparents, our own grandparents, in the most desperate times, managed to overcome endless obstacles and bring Israel to life against all odds. Zionism was a revolution in the history of the Jewish people. It was started by people who would no longer be powerless and defenseless, who would no longer let history happen to them. Since its earliest days, the gist of Zionism was the belief that in our capacity to shape our own destiny through collective action instead of waiting for divine salvation. It is the optimism, activism, and pragmatism of our founding fathers and mothers that is betrayed by Israel's current government. Our government is trying to sell us the worldview that we Israelis have no control over our destiny, that the world will be against us no matter what we do, and that there's no real chance for stable peace agreements with those who are today our enemies. This fatalism is undercutting our country's greatest achievements. In recent years, despite waves of terror attacks and the unrelenting scare tactics of the right, a consistent majority of Israelis remain supportive of the two-state solution. Many Israelis distrust the Palestinians. They're exhausted after years of conflict and genuinely fear for their security. But they realize that dividing the Holy Land between the two people who call it home is the only viable solution for keeping the Zionist ideal of being a free people in our own land alive. The right wing had worked very effectively to wear down progressive values, using the education system for their own political needs. But I know that the Israeli society still has the inner strength to make these painful but necessary changes. Our government is working to rebuild our movement is working to rebuild the progressive camp in order to bring this about. Those of you who share my belief in the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to ensure peace and justice for both nations must also share my objection to the BDS movement. The BDS movement is dangerous because it is dishonest. Under the guise of campaigning against the conflict, the boycott movement actually campaigns against Israel's right to exist. As such, the BDS validates the deep-seated Israeli fear that the legitimate demand for a Palestinian state alongside Israel is merely a disguise for an effort to establish a Palestinian state in Israel's place. Accordingly, the effect it has on the Israeli public only serves the right wing. When our closest allies begin to see BDS as an option, Israelis start to believe that the most extreme elements of the Israeli right claim daily that the world is against us and always will be. Those who want to promote the two-state solution and those who care about actually achieving peace and justice for both Israelis and Palestinians must oppose the BDS. What we need now is not more divisive boycotts. What we need is more cooperation. We need progressives of the world to unite. Since former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the labor leader who dedicated his life to Israel and was murdered 20 years ago by a fanatic for it, my generation has not known a comparable leader. Now, more than ever, Israel needs strong, courageous leadership. It is our generation's role to reboot the system, to build this new leadership. We have a global challenge. Today we see politicians speaking directly on every platform imaginable to people's greatest and very real fears. We see politicians who use racist statements to motivate their constituents, both here in the US and back home in Israel. This is a global problem. And the most absurd thing about these politicians is that the fear-mongering politicians present themselves as the biggest patriots, claiming that they love their country more than anyone else. Are you familiar with this? Now, disrespect, marginalization, sexism, and racism towards your fellow citizens is the opposite of loving your country. Depriving the weakest children of access to education or healthcare is the opposite of loving your country. Loving one's country means taking care of all of its citizens equally, an inclusive society that is free for all races, classes, sexual preferences, and genders. To love one's country means doing everything in your power to enable people to live without fear, and simultaneously to dedicate every other waking hour to fighting for peace, to make sure children can grow up believing they will have a fair chance to live a happy, safe life. We see the young generation rising up everywhere, in the Middle East and in Europe, in the US, in South America. And in order to succeed everywhere, we need to stand united everywhere. For us in Israel, time is working against us on every front. On the issues of the two-state solution for two people, on race and racism, and on income inequality. This is as true for America as it is for Israel. We need to fight intolerance and fear of the other. We need to force our leaders to break the cynicism that brought us here and move our world forward. The progressive camp in Israel has a lot to learn from you about community organizing and mobilizing our power base. What we're asking for is not your money, but your knowledge. We want to learn how you've done it so far and think together about how to continue forward. Our students, our children, the next generation are going to have to deal with the world we live in. We're privileged to live at this moment in history when our world has so much at stake and we have so many tools to fix it. I refuse to believe that our job as educators and leaders stops at survival, at managing to make it through. No, we're here to make it better. We need progressives of the world to unite. Together, we have the power to bring about real change. Thank you.